Well, back for another fiction writing lesson, are we?
This is a real classic by Mr. Pinsky. It's entitled 100 Girls I'd Like to Pork.
Okay, well, how about I tell you about the methods to write things? There are two ways to write fiction. Time's about infinity, but two main ways I'd like to talk to you about right now. The first is to just make it up as you go, and the other way is to work from an outline. And though you yourself might prefer one way over the other, in all likelihood you'll use both methods at different points throughout your writing career. And I'll try to explain the benefits of both. Anyway, let's talk about stories now. Okay, there are two main story types. Time's about infinity, but two main stories. No, not comedy and tragedy, theater majors, but stories are either plot-based or character-based. And that I mean you're either writing your story around a plot, like Lord of the Rings or most superhero movies, where the events that happen in the story are more important than the characters they're happening to. Or you're writing around a character or characters, like, I don't know, Field of Dreams, why not? And the people in the story are more important than what happens to them, essentially. I'm not saying that Frodo and Samwise aren't great characters, or that nothing happens to Kevin Costner after he builds his baseball field. But in order to tell a good story, you need both things to be fleshed out fully. But either with your characters or your plot, one will always be the thing that's driving your story forward over the other. Now, having heard that, and doing a little deductive reasoning and maybe a bit of writing, you'll notice that one style of writing is better for one style of storytelling. More specifically, character-driven stories typically behave better with the make-it-up-as-you-go style, while you want to make an outline before beginning a plot-driven story. Not always, of course. Every story's needs are different, but typically that's how it works.
We don't always get what we want, Miss Lane. Disappointments thicken our skins.
I'll give a little advice about writing both ways. Just know that even if you've decided to only work in one way, you'll probably need to do work in the other way somewhere along the lines, in order to make your story as good as it can be. But, as always, do whatever the hell you want.
What the devil do you want?
I want to make a very serious proposal.
In that outfit.
So let's talk about character-driven stories first. First, make a character. Get out a pen and write down their name and gender. Then write down a bit about each stage of their lives up until the age they are at the beginning of the story. Consider things like, what were their parents like? Do they have any siblings? Did they get along with their siblings while growing up, or did they fight all the time?
Don't you know how to knock phlegm wad?
Do they have lots of friends? Hobbies? Did they discover they had magical powers at some point? For each of these questions, or anything else you might come up with, I want you to think about the how and why of each situation. If they have powers, why do they have them, and how did they discover them?
You're a wizard, Harry.
If their parents beat them, why do they do that? And how did it start? Think of the consequences of these things. How have the forces in your character's life driven them to do the things they do? That being said, I'd like to say something about Mary Sue's. Mary Sue's are characters that are made to essentially be perfect. I think they come from the fact that writers think that what they're writing is meant to be fantasy, and so their characters should be a fantasized version of themselves. Real characters are just like real people. They make mistakes. They have actual flaws that are not just, they care too much. And even if that is a flaw, there are also times when they don't care, or when they're inexplicably selfish, or when bad things happen to them for apparently no reason and it breaks them. People are flawed and have positive and negative traits. Main characters typically have more positive than negative, but their negative traits are usually just as apparent as their positive ones.
Oh.
Now I just wanted to talk about Deadpool for a second.
That does it! Oh! 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 Canada!
Deadpool is great because he's essentially a loser who just happens to have the advantage of not being able to die. He's a good fighter, but he's not the best at planning stuff. He mostly just keeps failing until he finally succeeds. That's all.
Bad news is, the whole team is dead. The good news is, I don't think anyone's gonna miss Shatterstar. He was a bit of a prick.
Anyway, the next part is plot outlines for plot-driven stories. And you can do these however you like, but I'm going to talk to you about something called the snowball method.
That was Snowball.
Why do you call him that?
Called as much because it's like a snowball going downhill, gathering more stuff as it goes. Start by writing a sentence, which doesn't have to be short, but make it a single sentence that explains what your story is about. If you're writing this before writing the first Matrix movie, you'd probably write something like, everyone is living in a game reality. Someone finds out he's Superman, and then punches people. You know, it doesn't have to be too complex at this point. Next, we'll split things into acts. Most things are written in a 3-act structure, but don't feel like you have to do that. But 3-act structure is easiest to understand, so we'll talk about that. This is because each of the 3 acts can be easily split up into the beginning, the middle, and the end. And if you want to split it down more, you could say there's a beginning, middle, and end of each of these 3 acts. You could keep splitting things up at this point, but that's the complexity we need to get right now. What you essentially want to figure out right now is 1, how your story begins, 2, how the first act ends, 3, how the second act begins, 4, how the second act ends, 5, how the third act begins, and 6, the climax, which isn't necessarily how the story ends because there's usually a denouement or the thing that wraps up everything at the end, but the climax is the most important part of your story when all the things you've been setting up finally get its payoff. Anyway, write those things down beneath that initial sentence. Remember that each time you end an act, it has to be with something that turns the entire story completely around. For our Matrix example, at the end of the first act, Neo discovers he is living in a simulation, and at the end of the second act, one of the crew betrays them and Morpheus gets captured. Second acts usually end with our characters in the worst spot they could possibly be in, but not always. Next, you want to do a scene-by-scene outline, explain everything that goes on in each scene in as much detail as you want to write. After that, you write your story, following along with your outline, but don't think anything is written in stone. Change things as you see fit as you write everything out. I guess that's it. Remember to subscribe to your favorite comic books, because comics are awesome.